Let's learn about degrowth. OMG, I'm so excited.
So I first learned about degrowth from a professor of mine, and not gonna lie, I was pretty skeptical at first. But the more we read and the more we discussed, the more I kind of started to see the logic. But I've always kind of had a hard time explaining it to people who haven't studied it, and my peers have expressed similar frustrations. I think in part because the language used to talk about it can be so academic and specialized to certain fields that it's really excludes people from taking part in the conversation, which I think is dumb. So yeah, I guess we'll see how I do. Bear with me. There's a lot of different ways in which psychologists break down the necessary components of human well-being, but for our purposes today, I'm gonna crazy oversimplify it and break it down into 4 different categories. The first sphere of human well-being is goods and materials, so food, water, shelter, clothing, the basics. The second sphere is social relationships. The third is health, that includes both mental and physical. And fourth is environment. What's interesting about these 4 spheres is that the latter 3, being social relationships, health, and environment, all increase well-being essentially limitlessly. But the first one, essentially material wealth, only increases well-being to a point. I've always kind of hated the saying money doesn't buy happiness because anyone who's ever been even a little bit hungry knows that's not true. But it also kind of is. There is a point once your base needs have been met after which material accumulation doesn't make you happier. There's something that we talked a lot about in school called the happiness income paradox. The basic idea is that both among and within nations, income is correlated with happiness. So generally, if you're richer, you're happier, and if you're poorer, you're sadder. However, happiness does not increase as a country's income increases. It only increases when relative incomes become more equal. So basically, the amount of money that your neighbor makes has a lot more of an impact on your happiness than actually how much you make in general. Degrowth is essentially the idea that we need to focus on those spheres which can improve our well-being rather than the one that doesn't. Pulling a definition from a book, degrowth is an equitable downscaling of production and consumption that increases human well-being and enhances ecological conditions at the local and global level in the short and long term. This means that as a whole, we need to achieve a steady state economy that is at equilibrium with resource availability. And to do this fairly, the richest nations will need to reduce consumption such that the poorest can achieve a dignified quality of life. And that's kind of where we start to lose people.
OMG, did she just suggest like a voluntary recession?
No. Degrowth is not a recession, and its proponents are very adamant about this. Rather, it is a planned and equitable economic contraction in the richest nations, eventually reaching a global steady state that is within the Earth's biophysical limits. It does mean a reduction in material consumption, but not necessarily quality of life and well-being. Think of it as kind of like Marie Kondoing the whole system. If you love minimalism or camping or have some kind of like idyllic fantasy about escaping to the countryside and skipping through the daisies, those are the kind of lifestyles we're talking about. We're not talking about sacrificing anything. We're just talking about refocusing our priorities. I really love this quote by one of my favorite sci-fi authors, Ursula K. Le Guin. It goes, "I am not proposing a return to the Stone Age. My intent is not reactionary nor even conservative, but simply subversive. It seems that the utopian imagination is trapped, like capitalism and industrialism and the human population, in a one-way future consisting only of growth. All I'm trying to do is figure out how to put a pig on the tracks." Degrowth is a pig. You heard it here first. The goals of the degrowth movement include greater equality, democracy, diversity, sharing and cooperation, and physical, psychological, and social health. But what does that look like in practice? I'm going to talk about 7 main policy suggestions. Well, I don't know about main, but 7 policy suggestions that kind of fit within the degrowth paradigm. The first being redistributive policies. So things like progressive income taxes, wealth taxes, inheritance taxes, such that wealth is redistributed and we achieve a more equitable distribution. 2, universal basic income or universal basic services. There is some debate as to which is better, but the idea is basically to guarantee certain public services such as access to clean water, education, healthcare, internet, electricity, the very basics, such that everyone is taken care of without having to depend on employers for health insurance, for example. 3. Localized production. This means trying to satisfy consumption needs as close to the production point as possible, shifting from long-distance trade to local distribution chains. This definitely implies a rewriting of some international trade agreements. This not only decreases the energy required for transportation, but also creates greater systems resiliency in case, say, I don't know, a pandemic occurred. Things like zero waste movements and 0 kilometer food movements and farmers markets are all grassroots efforts at localizing production. 4. Environmental limits on resource use. This one's pretty obvious. We have a limited amount of stuff. We need a budget for that. 5. No more planned obsolescence. This is the stupidest thing that makes me so angry. The way that companies freaking make things that are literal trash so that we have to buy a new one 2 seconds later. Instead of companies releasing new models of phones and cars and clothes every few months such that you have to repurchase a new one, you build things that are made to last and repair the things you already have instead of replacing them. 6. A reduction in working hours. The idea behind this is that it essentially creates employment in the absence of growth, so you have more people working to make the same things. Most people argue for maintaining the same wages while doing this, and it is actually very possible. For example, while in China a 72-hour 6-day work week is not uncommon, in Germany and the UK, recently workers have been successfully negotiating the right to work less than 40 hours a week for the same pay. The UK's Labour Party has even floated the idea of a national 4-day work week. Working less not only reduces emissions related to commuter travel, but it also means you have more time for friends and family and leisure. Research shows that it also usually means a reduction in people eating convenience foods, which isn't great not only for your health, but also because there's a lot of packaging involved in those kinds of foods, etc., etc. It also has been shown that people spend more time outdoors, they spend more time engaging in hobbies and volunteering in their communities. So while it may mean some people do get paid less, remember policy number 2, which was universal basic income or universal basic services. Nobody will be at risk of not having what they need to live. 7. Use of non-GDP indicators of human and ecological well-being. There are so many alternatives. People have come up with all kinds of ways to measure human well-being. The Human Development Index is pretty popular with the UN. The Happiness Index is pretty popular, etc., etc. And some countries are already doing this. For example, New Zealand's Prime Minister, my queen, has called growth at all costs capitalism a blatant failure and announced that the government will no longer accept GDP as the sole supreme measure of progress, which I think is just so beautiful. I also want to address some criticisms of degrowth because it is important to acknowledge that it's not perfect. First, degrowth acknowledges our dependence on care work or women's work, but it fails to address it head on. There's a quote from Callis's book that says, "Growth has always been based on exploitation. Without a surplus, there is no investment and no growth. To have a surplus, capitalists or governments must exploit someone somewhere. If they paid this someone the real value of her work, then there would not be a surplus and there would be no growth. First, there were the slaves and the natives of the colonies. Then there were the commoners and the workers in the factories, and of course, there will always be the women at home." Ecofeminist economics points out that there is a parallel between the exploitation of women's work and the exploitation of natural resources. Both are necessary for capitalism/growth to occur, but remain widely costless and unrecognized by the formal economy because they are considered natural and free of charge. Thus, any attempt at sustainable, systemic economic change is intrinsically linked to gender equity, and the degrowth movement needs to suggest policies that directly address this fact. Second, degrowth has a collective action problem. Like I mentioned in my previous video about economic growth, it is hard for one country to opt out of the pursuit of growth because it may threaten their national security. Therefore, all countries, or at least enough of the ones with significant military power, must agree to pursue degrowth simultaneously. Third, I think some people reject the idea of degrowth because it kind of sounds too good to be true.
Wow, we can work less and be happier. Doesn't that just sound like a utopia?
And let's be honest, pinning our hopes on utopic visions has worked out for exactly nobody ever. Yet, on the flip side, other people reject degrowth because it doesn't provide a concrete and specific vision of the utopia it's trying to create. But these two things, this vision of a utopia that is simultaneously too specific and not specific enough, I think is one of the strengths of degrowth, because it gives us something towards which to strive and hope and dream for, but it doesn't box us in the way other utopic visions have. It gives us the flexibility to experiment, to acknowledge that maybe there is no such thing as a utopia, and the humility to realize we may have gotten some things wrong. But honestly, I think the biggest source of pushback comes from our natural resistance to change and our fear of uncertainty, which, believe me, I completely understand. I do not enjoy uncertainty. Degrowth is essentially a reversal of everything we think we know. But the fact that capitalism is our reality does not make it more reasonable. For thousands of years, slavery was considered inevitable, but that does not mean slavery was reasonable or necessary. Regardless of the path we choose to take, pursuing systemic change is going to be hard, but we don't really have a choice. That's all I have to say about degrowth for now. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, as usual, please feel free to reach out. I would be more than happy to chat with you about it. I'm going to link a whole bunch of resources below, so that if you want to read up about stuff, you can. And yeah, I have an Instagram and a Twitter if you want to follow me. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video if you liked it, if you learned something. I hope you learned something.